So in this video, what we're going to do is see how you can render out a project with layers. Now, there are lots of reasons why you might want to do this. We'll take a look at some of those, and we'll go through the whole setup process, both in Cinema 4D, Redshift, and After Effects. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so we're going to see how we can render out something in different layers from Cinema 4D and Redshift and also put it together in After Effects. Maybe do something like this where you want to be able to show the different kind of layers or systems that make up part of the body, where you have your skin, your muscle, bone, nervous system, whatever. And all I've really done here is layered these on top of each other and used a mask to control how we're transitioning or fading from one layer to the next. And that might be something you want to do. Another option with this particular setup is we could just work with the overall opacity with these layers, things like that. Things that, if we were trying to do this in Cinema 4D might require a lot of re-rendering, especially for trying to match the timing from voiceover or any callouts, things like that. Another example might be something like this logo here, where when you cut out part of your image, you don't want to see the alpha or transparency through it. You would like that to be solid. All right. This probably isn't as common of a use case, but we will see this example because we'll be using it to kind of talk about what happens when we start working with the lights and shadows and how they interact and work with our objects here. Because that's kind of something that you may have noticed with this one, is that it really doesn't look like anything is interacting with each other when it comes to the lighting and shadows of these elements. There's nothing kind of wrapped around here like you would expect to see and is, how the model actually looks in Cinema 4D. So right now, everything is either in front or behind. And in this example, we see there are things that kind of go through or wrap around other objects that can make this process a little bit more difficult, but we'll see how we can fix that. So jumping into Cinema 4D, we have kind of the first example here with the arm, right? Just kind of a simple animation here. And it helps to be organized in this process because as we'll see, we're going to need to reuse a lot of the naming here. And also it being organized like this is going to help us set up our takes, which is going to help us streamline this process. Because essentially what we want to do, and it helps to have everything in a null that you can hide, right? That'll hide everything, because all we're really doing is just rendering out one part of this at a time. And you could absolutely do this process manually, go through, show what you want, render it, and then move on to the next layer. But that's pretty tedious. It's time consuming. And not only that, you have to kind of sit here and start each render on its own, as opposed to when we get into takes, we'll be able to render everything at once. And should you need to re-render everything, you have to go through that process again. All right. And so that's why I like to use takes for this. So I'm going to right click here and undock it, so we can just see this a little bit easier. And takes are a very powerful part of Cinema 4D. I did a video a long time ago about them. They're great if you want to have different versions of your scene, perhaps different objects visible, render out different layers, have different materials on parts of your scene with different renders, things like that. Okay, now when it comes to takes, you have a main take by default. I try to avoid using this. And what I'm going to do is create a few child takes, and I'm going to create child takes for each of the systems I want, although I probably won't do all of them because that would be a little bit repetitive. So we'll just go through and maybe create 4, and I'm just going to name these skeletal, circulatory, all right, muscular, and we'll do, why don't we do the integumentary, or actually let's just call it skin, because that's what it is. And I'm having a hard time pronouncing that word. So now what we want to do is, when we're on these takes, we want to have it show what objects we want to render. Now, there are two different ways you can do that. You can manually set overrides on pretty much any property you want. In our case, it would actually be the viewport and render visibility, but you can just right click, you could choose override. The other option is to use auto takes, which is similar to auto keying. And you have to be very careful with this, because if you forget you are in a different take, if you forget you have auto take on, you can end up really doing a number to that particular take, or perhaps your entire scene. So I use this very carefully, but essentially I'm going to turn on auto take. And because of the way this is organized, I've hidden everything with the main null here. And I can just go through to each part I want and just click show. And that's the overrides it's going to show us now right in here. And we could, go into there and see that exactly, but that should be good enough. And I'm just going to repeat that process. And so while we do have to do a similar setup here, it's something we only have to do once. So I'll do the same thing on circulatory after I switch to it, set the bottom and top stoplight to green. So that part is visible, and repeat that for the muscular system. Wait for that to show up. And then lastly, the skin. Okay, so we have each of our layers set up here. And then what we can do when we're ready to render these is actually just check them on, or mark them as Cinema 4D calls it, because then you can come up here and you can choose render marked takes. And it will render each of these out one at a time, one right after another. So no having to babysit the render and then move on to the next one. So that's another advantage of takes. Takes can also use different cameras, as well as different render settings. And the render settings can be helpful if we are going to use, say, different frame ranges for each of these, along with a different camera. That's often how I use them is, to render out multiple cameras, different frame ranges, all from the same file. But in this case, it's pretty straightforward, and that's kind of all we need to do in here. At this point, I can close my takes. If I want to get them back, I can just click on the standard layout again to kind of reset this. I did that previously. And then the last thing I would do here is in our render settings, in our save option here, I need to do something with these file names, because if I just set a generic file name like beauty, well, then each of those takes is going to have the same file name and they'll just override each other. And Cinema 4D has thought of this. That's where we have these tokens or different parts of a file name that, are based on different information in our scene. Things like what camera you're looking through, what pass it is, or even what take. And so if you just select this token, tokens are kind of made up of the $ and a word, in this case, take. And so when I go to render this now, it would be beauty underscore skeletal, beauty underscore circulatory, or whatever I've named these takes. And you could do the same thing with your multipass or AOVs as well. And if you know the take, you can actually just type it in, if that's a little bit easier for you. And I would use PNGs, at least that's what I typically do. And I would be ready to render this, okay? And so once you render it, just kind of like I did before and what we saw, I would put this together in a composition. And I'll go ahead and kind of do that for us right now by just dragging everything into a new composition. And this is what I was talking about with some of the issues we're running into here, right? The layering doesn't appear right. So that's something we're going to have to work on. So I'm going to have to take the skin. That's going to need to be on the top. It could also maybe be on the bottom as well. Okay. But we'll need to lower the opacity so we can see through to everything else. That may be another reason to put it underneath, right? So you could do something like that. But here, the order does matter. And so as I mentioned, we're not getting any lights or shadows because each of these was rendered out separately between these. They don't interact with each other. Nothing's kind of wrapped around that. And so that does give this a little bit of a weird look, how, things are always in front of or on top of one another, when in reality, there's probably something being lost with this type of approach to the rendering. What does help though is working with the opacity. Like I mentioned, it'd be very easy to come in here to, like the lymphatic and nervous ones, turn down their opacities so they don't look quite as visible. Same thing with circulatory, right? So that's helping a little bit there as well. And then decide, should the muscle be on top? If it is, it hides a lot of that stuff. So working with a lot of opacity or masks, like I mentioned before, and all this stuff can be adjusted, which is one of the great things here. And as you were seeing previously, I was using masks to control these as well, which is another way to transition. So really nice way of doing this. And I'm doing it all, oops, let me skip here, in After Effects. So I don't have to do any work or more rendering out of Cinema 4D where it would be more tedious and time consuming. Now, the one thing I did forget to mention here in the setup process is what to do about a background or how to work with the alpha channel, because that is extremely important. It's something that I kind of glossed over here, but you can see that we do have an alpha channel. We do have nothing behind the body. And so that's something we would also need to set up here. And that's pretty standard and easy to do. So I just have the skin layer turned on here, but essentially in your dome lights. And so this is where you can run into problems because this blue lets us know we're in a take. So I don't want to do it in a take because then I would have to do it for each one. So instead I can do it to the main take and it will apply to all of them. But just like you would typically do is uncheck background. And I do happen to have 2 dome lights. Don't ask me why. And then in my camera, I have a background. We can turn that off. And so if I switch back to one of my takes now, like my skin, and make sure we take a look at our alpha and double check to make sure it's on in our render settings. So it would save, we can see that we would be good to go. And so that will allow us to composite everything together like we were seeing before. Now, as for this logo here, this is where things get a little bit interesting because as I mentioned, we have things going through other objects that it's going to be very noticeable if that's not correct, whether it's the hammer and wrench going through the tires or the wire wrapping around at the bottom there. So I also thought this would be a better example to take a look at kind of what things look like with the lighting and shadows and how to work with those aspects of working with layers in Cinema 4D. So I think, let's see, the takes already set up a little bit, okay, although they don't look like they're actually active. So what I would do here is rather than creating all of these, so for the background, actually just break this out again, which is I really only do this as I'm setting up my takes. After that, I don't mind just toggling back and forth, or, I can also dock it down there. And so now I can work with them both at the same time. And if I have a well-organized object manager, that certainly helps too. So the trick with this one though, is rather than hide and show everything, we're going to work with the Redshift object tag. That's how we're going to preserve the shadows, reflections, things like that, the interaction with those objects that you typically see. So what I'll do is add all of these. And there are certain things you can do when you're on a child take that just kind of carry through, and adding a tag to an object is something like that. Same with creating geometry. But what I would do is back on my background take, say, all right, and actually we will want one here as well. But in all of these elements, what I'm going to do is check override. And I'm just going to uncheck primary ray visible. So they're there, they're just not visible to the camera. And so this will look a little bit strange when it updates because we should still see the reflections of these elements on the background as well as with the shadow. All right, now whether you want this or don't, that's entirely up to you. But I did want to show what it would look like. And so we just kind of work our way through that, kind of the same thing way we did before with the previous takes, hiding and showing things. Now it's just using that override in our Redshift object tag. So this is our tool type here. So what I'm going to do is select every Redshift object tag, but that one, and then uncheck primary ray visible. All right, you'll see it go away, everything else go away, and we just repeat that process. Now, things get a little bit weird on some of these. I noticed it on the hammer, right? So kind of the same thing. Select actually all of our tags, uncheck the hammer, check override, uncheck primary ray visible, right? And notice all of these strange kind of shadows we're getting on the hammer that we don't typically see because they're covered up. And so this is a situation where you go, well, wait a second, maybe I don't want this. All right, but that is kind of a part of the final logo. It's just not something we're used to seeing, right? If I switch back to my main take, give this a second to update, it's all there. We're just not, seeing it because it's behind that. Same thing with the background shape here. If I was to set up this one, same thing, come here, it's the shape, override, uncheck primary ray visible, right? We're gonna see this and we go, oh, darn it, what do we have, the shadow from our tool text on this. And so, this isn't necessarily what you might have expected to see. And it's true that this perhaps isn't as workable as you might expect or have wanted it to be. And so, once again, maybe hiding other layers would help, right? You could hide the tool text. You could also come in here to the Redshift object tag and work with the exclusion section here to help kind of clean this up. So that way, perhaps we're excluding, say, the tool text, and that shadow goes away. The problem with that is then it isn't going to look as natural when everything's together, because there is some shading, some shadow there, right? So you do have to be a bit careful with that. And it's not something that there's, it's very easy to just mention a couple of rules or things to do and it works 100% of the time. But you really kind of have to have a good understanding with your scene, what you want out of it, and also what you're planning to do with it in After Effects. Because the whole point of this is that we're trying to save time and, give ourselves more flexibility in After Effects. And if you're not sure if you need it, then this probably isn't the best approach. Like I said, I have used it in the past for setups like this, where it's more human anatomy, medical type stuff, where the layering isn't as big of a deal, or I can, fix that inside of After Effects. And so that's actually the next thing we're going to take a look at here is, so we have set up our individual layers. The rendering process would pretty much be the exact same in terms of setting up. I already have it set up here. Look at me with, our tokens, same with our multipass or AOVs, but I am going to have to render out something from my main take here. Okay. And there are a couple of different ways you could approach that. You could approach it with rendering out the objects like the tire and the wire, the things that go in front or behind, and create puzzle mats for those, or you could create puzzle mats for the objects themselves that need to kind of go through something like the hammer, the wrench, and the wire, which is what I ended up doing. So just to kind of show that really quickly, what I did is I created a puzzle mat and just assign the IDs, 1, 2, and 3 using object ID, since we already have those tags on there. And on those objects like the hammer here, just object ID 1, the wrench is 2, and the wire was 3. And that's what I would render out. And we'll go ahead and switch to After Effects now to see how to put it all together. Back in After Effects, I've already imported all of our sequences here, so I didn't want to bore you with that. And we can start putting this together. And just like we were seeing previously, kind of the order does matter, right? You can see that each one of these elements, once again, does have transparency. So, setting up the alpha channel like we talked about previously, you could also just have a puzzle mat here to cut everything out. That would be a lot of extra rendering unless you really needed your background here. But this is kind of what that wrench looks like throughout the entire time. And it's nice that it's here because, aside from just working with, the transparency or masks, you could add any number of effects to help transition this to on. A lot of these effects I don't typically recommend, right? But just as kind of something to show, we have our block dissolve, which you could then use on a layer like this. And once again, don't recommend this, but just as another example of why you might want to do this, to give this a little bit more interest, to add other things happening to our projects inside of After Effects, that's absolutely a way you could do this. And now what we need to do is order this, kind of what's closest to the camera, what's farthest. So I would start with the tool text. And I don't really want to look at that, just that layer. So that will go on top here. And then I would have the background shape. All right, our background, right, which is really this thing, absolutely at the bottom here. And honestly, we've gotten pretty close already. So what we would do is take what else? The text, and make sure that's above the tire, right? The wire, that's kind of where we start to run into problems. The wrench probably should be beneath it, but now it's, kind of in front of one. The hammer's in a weird spot. So let's take that. And so that looks okay, but the wire should actually be behind the tire here. And both of these need to be behind or coming through the tire. And our type needs to be in front of all of that. So you can start to see how we're running into some problems here. The tire also needs to be in front of a lot of these things. So that's where our object buffers or puzzle mats object buffers, wow, that's from the standard or physical render, can come in handy here. And so all I did was set it up for the 3 elements that are really causing me the most problems. And that would be the hammer, the wrench, and the wire. Hopefully that's enough. We'll see. So let's see, we'll start with the wrench here. Effect, channel, set mat, have it take from our puzzle mat. And let's see, I don't know which one it is. So let's solo that layer. All right, so that is the wrench. All right, we can see it's now cut out. So once again, the wiring is important, or the order is important here, but now we can place that a little bit further up because it's cut out. In fact, it could even be, I believe, on top, and it won't matter because it's using that puzzle mat. All right, same thing with the hammer, right? We'll move it up here, channel, set mat, puzzle mat, and let's try green. That looks like we got lucky with that one. All right, so that's looking good. And then lastly, the wire, let's see, where's that? Actually, let's just copy this set mat effect. So I don't have to go through that process. This will be blue. And there we go. Now we have everything kind of as is. Now, I will say the puzzle mats do kind of, I don't want to say defeat the purpose of this, but they kind of do here, right? Because the idea was you could have the wrench be visible the entire time. And so that isn't the case with, when you are using a puzzle mat. There's still kind of more you could do with that to help. And that's where I do think perhaps kind of having the tire as a mask or mat in the puzzle mat would have solved a lot of our issues for us. But once again, each scene, each project's going to be different in that regard. So you may have to experiment with a little bit to get the order correct to have it kind of work exactly the way you want. But with that will do it for this one. If there's anything else you would like to see, please leave me a comment down below. And if you found this video helpful, I'd appreciate it if you could like it and subscribe to my channel. Until next time, take care.